Welcome back to Wheels in Motion, and welcome to William Howard Taft High School, where we're here with parents and students and faculty members. And these students here are a member of an organization called Project Yield. Tori, can you tell us about what YIELD stands for?
Project YIELD stands for Youth Informing Every Living Driver.
Alexis, can you tell us exactly what your purpose is?
The purpose of Project YIELD is for teens to make other teens aware of the top 5 driving risks and hopefully decrease the number of car crashes.
Okay, now it's pretty unusual for a high school to have an organization for this specific purpose. You know, why? Why do you feel so passionate about safe driving?
In the recent years, we've had about 6 car wrecks around Taft, and they had to do with students. And we realized the impact that these crashes had made at the school. So when the opportunity to come up with this program and to make this program here at Taft, we thought it would be necessary and important. And when we did do the program, we realized that the seniors, it made a huge impact to them. And not only the seniors, but the juniors and the sophomores and the freshmen who saw the seniors' impact, it influenced them as well. So we thought that we made a good job, and we made at least a dent in them to see what car crashes had to do with them.
We really admire what you and the other students here at Taft High are doing with this Project YIELD. And we're going to speak more with you as well as some of the other students and parents and faculty members that are here today. But first, let's take a look at a video that these students put together themselves. I understand that they wrote and directed and produced it on their own. It's done by students, for students.
Wow.
Congratulations on getting your new license.
Yeah, I hope you know how to drive.
Chill out. I got it.
So who's all going to go to the party?
Everyone's going to show up.
I heard there's going to be a keg.
By the way, you're picking up James, right?
Well, how about you call him and tell him we'll be there in a little bit?
Ugh, this thing's ugly. How do you work this thing?
Get it here. Hey, what's up? Oh, yeah? Y'all gonna be ready in about 5? All right. Well, make sure y'all got the beer, okay? We'll be there in a few, all right? Bye.
Oh my gosh, did you hear it was gonna be that party, that cute guy we saw on the stairs? You remember?
Are you serious?
Oh my gosh,
he's
he's so hot. I know.
know.
Hey James, what's up?
Nothing, how about you all?
We're waiting for Mike to get here. He's taking his sweet time getting here. Oh, look, there he is.
Hey, y'all, let's go.
Three of us coming. Scoot over. Scoot over. Scoot over.
Hey, what's up, James?
How are you?
Hey, James.
I can't close the door.
Scoot over. Yeah, scoot over. Your hair looks cute, Tori.
Thank you.
Dude, if I knew it was gonna be so crowded in here, I would have got another ride.
Don't worry, we'll be there in a minute.
Here, celebrate your new license. Hey,
Watch where you're going.
Alexis, move. You're on my seatbelts.
Don't worry about it. None of us are wearing seatbelts.
Fine.
Chill out.
Wow, what an incredible video.
Yeah.
It's a really strong message. Congratulations to all of you that worked on that. That was really well done.
Absolutely, that was amazing.
Pamela Maldonado is Project YIELD's faculty sponsor. Who gets to see this video?
Actually, all the students here at Taft got to see the video. What we did is we introduced it the week prior to spring break. Every day we introduced one of the 5 messages. And then prior to going on spring break, we showed the video to the whole student body.
I imagine it's received very well.
Yes, it was received very well by the students here.
Okay, now, as reflected in this video, Project Yield promotes all kinds of safe driving among young people, correct?
Correct.
But your mission isn't just to warn against drunk driving, is that right?
That's correct.
All right, and you see, that's something we appreciate. We actually hope to do the same thing. For the purposes of this discussion, we want to look specifically at the topic of driving under the influence among teens and among adults. Let me introduce to you Miss Montague. Miss Vanessa Montague lost her 18-year-old daughter, Mandy, in an alcohol-related crash. Miss Montague will be sharing her story with us today. And Mike Avila. Mr. Avila's mother was killed in an alcohol-related crash. He, too, will be sharing his story with us today. And finally, Dr. Maury Dennis. Dr. Maury Dennis is a professor and researcher at Texas A&M University. He's also the director of the Center for Alcohol and Drug Education Studies. He's recognized across the nation as a leading authority on issues related to drinking and driving. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for being here.
Let's turn the floor over to Mrs. Montague.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. After I lost my 18-year-old daughter, Mandy, about 5 years ago, one of the first things that occurred to me was that I wish somebody had told her. She made a decision one night to let somebody else drive her car, and the boy was drunk. And he crashed the car, and unfortunately after he crashed the car, he left the scene. My daughter, she didn't have any life-threatening injury. She actually only had 4 broken ribs and a bruised spleen. And he saw a house that was lit up down the road, and he climbed out of the car and went to the nearby house, and he got a ride home that night. And when he got home, he didn't tell his parents or anybody else that my daughter was in the car. Instead, he went to sleep, and he slept for 8 hours. One time and one time only, he admitted to having 6 or 7 beers, and it was the tall boys. And they were on a country road, so there wasn't any traffic to come by. And it was probably about 5, maybe 6 hours later when somebody found my daughter. The car, when it crashed, it landed upside down. He had been going about 65 miles an hour on the country road, and he came upon some railroad tracks and was unable to stop, and the car became airborne. And so when the crash actually happened, the car was still going 65 miles an hour. After it flipped over, she had seat belts and they had the airbags, and they both worked and technically saved both of their lives. But her seat, when the crash happened, her seat pushed forward, and the seat belt, like they do, locked into place. You know how they hold you so that you don't go through the glass and everything. Well, this created 2 forces against her body, and they told me later that whenever they extracted her from the car, that at the time they found her, that the seat belt was embedded about 1 to 2 inches into her chest. And technically, she died because she suffocated. All she needed was for him to unhook her seat belt. And if he had unhooked her seat belt, she could climb out of the car the way he did. I still pray that she didn't know. I pray that she was knocked out. You know, one of them, I don't know if the students realize it or even the parents, but unfortunately the #1 killer of our youth is car crashes. And the #1 reason for a car crash is alcohol. And the #2 reason is speed. And it was a combination of both of these that resulted in my daughter's death. The boy, he is in jail. He will be there for 5 years. Not enough time, but 5 years, and then he'll have probation afterwards. And when he gets out, he will have to pay. He will pay the money that goes towards my daughter's funeral. Dustin was very, very lucky, in a sense, if you want to call it that way, because he only has to pay back $6,000. There was no medical bills or anything like that. But the judge felt like he should pay for one thing, and that was the cost of burying my daughter. So when he gets out of prison, he'll start making payments each month. You know, and that's one thing I always ask the kids, you know, is what do you think it would be like to pay for your friend's funeral? You know, and one of the ladies, somebody had mentioned earlier about the fact that even the freshmen listen to the stories. And I think that's very important because maybe they're not driving, but they are getting in cars with people who are driving. And more often than not, it's the passengers that die. So they need to know, too, that it's just as important not to get in a car with a drunk driver as it is for you not to drink and drive. It just goes to show that it does happen, and it happens more than we realize. And our teenagers especially need to be more careful in their cars and realize that they are weapons when they're not used correctly.
Mrs. Montague, thank you so much for sharing that with us. I appreciate that. Mr. Avila is going to share his story with us, and then afterwards we'll open the floor for questions. Mr. Avila?
Thank you for having me here. Coincidentally, my story begins here in San Antonio, Texas also. I was born here in 1975, and I was raised in a single-parent home by my mother. We grew up on the south side of San Antonio, and life was a little rough for us growing up. My mother did a lot of things to try to make our life as comfortable as possible here in San Antonio, and she worked 2 jobs for the majority of her life, trying to raise 2 of her 3 children singly. By the time I was about 13 years old, I was in a rehab program already for drug abuse, and this persisted for quite some time in my life. I had bouts with alcohol and drug abuse that went and came and so forth in my life, but the majority of my life was covered by alcohol abuse majorly. In 1992, we were living in Austin, Texas, and my mother had left our house for Easter weekend and returned back to San Antonio to meet some of our family for preparations. My mother made it here fine to San Antonio and did so at that day, though she did have a new boyfriend, and he was not from San Antonio. He was from a small town called Uvalde, Texas. His name was Frank, and Frank decided that afternoon that he wanted to go put some flowers at his parents' gravesite in Uvalde, Texas. So he, my mother, and his oldest brother left in their vehicle from San Antonio, Texas, heading out to Uvalde. On their way out there that afternoon, a crash occurred sometime in the mid-afternoon, about 3 or 4 o'clock. My mother was sitting in the back seat of their vehicle, and Frank was driving. The oldest brother was riding passenger side. They were heading down Highway 90 out of San Antonio, Texas, and as they were heading down the highway, they were in the farthest right-hand lane of the highway. They were proceeding out to Uvalde, Texas, and were within about a 5-mile radius of entering the town. About 30 minutes prior to that, a lady by the name of Betty Lopez had left Uvalde, Texas, and had been drinking alcohol and had been smoking a little bit of marijuana. Coincidentally, on that afternoon, as my mother and her new boyfriend were heading down the highway, a train track passes parallel with the highway, and they were watching the train as it was passing them. In one of the instances, as they were glazing at the train, Frank, who was driving, had to put his head back to the highway, obviously. In one of those instances, Betty Lopez had passed out on her vehicle from the farthest lane away from my mother's vehicle and blacked out and lost control of her vehicle. And Betty Lopez came clear across the highway and took an almost direct impact with my mother's vehicle. The 2 vehicles collided that afternoon, and Betty Lopez continued down the highway on the wrong side and came to a slow stop. Now, my mother's vehicle took the majority of the impact. It was thrown into the air. It did several rotations while it was being thrown into the air and landed on its top and was finally stopped by the guardrail on the side of the highway. The oldest brother of my mother's boyfriend, Frank, came out of the wreck with few minor bruises and scratches. Frank, who was driving at the time, took the majority of the impact, and Frank left that day to San Antonio Hospital in intensive care, and he arrived here missing a left eye, missing a left knee, and the top portion of his the top portion of his left arm. Frank was in intensive care for about 2 or 3 weeks before he was released from there that day, but he did survive the wreck. Now, my mother, on the other hand, was in the back seat, as I previously said, and as the 2 vehicles collided, the rear end was thrown up first in my mother's vehicle, and for some reason that afternoon, she decided not to wear a seatbelt. As the vehicle was thrown up into the air, sorry. As the vehicle was thrown into the air, my mother was ejected face first out of the back windshield. She was thrown about 20 to 25 feet and landed on the highway. As the vehicle landed after that and was stopped by the highway railing. My mother's point of death was put at about 3:30 that afternoon, and she died from severe head trauma when she arrived in Uvalde after the paramedics arrived on the scene. My mother had severe facial lacerations across her entire face and portions of her body, and after the impact on the highway, she broke almost every bone in her body. Now the other side of the story was Betty Lopez, who had caroused to a slow stop on the other side of the highway. Betty Lopez came out with no minor infractions to her body, and the only thing that she could complain about to the officers that arrived on the scene was that her beers had spilt over and that someone had hit her. She was so incoherent that day that she did not know what had occurred. Several months later, we proceeded on to the court procedures for Betty Lopez. She was tried in court in Uvalde, Texas, and found guilty of involuntary manslaughter. Betty Lopez was sentenced to do a jail time of 10 years. She served 150 days in county jail, was released and sent to San Antonio, Texas to serve out a probationary period, where a year later she violated with her 4th DWI, and from there was sent to the women's correctional facilities here in Texas. I found myself to be 18 years old, had my own apartment, had my own truck, my own job, paying my own bills, and life was pretty good from the point of view of an alcoholic and drug abuser. Eventually, I could not handle the world anymore, and I went on a very fast decline down. Found myself doing more cocaine than I had ever done, found myself doing many other drugs along with alcohol. Eventually, I lost my vehicle, I lost my apartment, and found myself homeless for several months. And for the second year in a row in 1995, I wound up in jail once again in Austin, Texas. It was Christmas time, and I woke up in a jail cell and decided that morning that I would not drink or drug abuse myself anymore. And from that point forward, I've been sober. I'm going on my 9th year of my sobriety. Things that haven't changed, though, for me, is the fact that my mother is no longer here. I graduated high school. She did not see that. I graduated college. She did not see that. If I ever decide to get married, have children, I don't have a mother to be there to witness it. My children won't have a grandmother. I have a father that's never participated in my life substantially. And so I've lived the majority of my life without parents. And I only had 16 years to live with my mother. My main concern often in discussing with children and youth in high schools and so forth and trying to portray to them an image of what has occurred to me in my life is that you don't get the option anymore. Betty Lopez made a decision for me one afternoon and made a choice for me. And that choice was that I get to no longer hear my mother's voice. I don't remember what she looks like sometimes. I don't get to remember what it's like to hug her. I don't get to tell her the things that I get to see. She doesn't get to see that her son sobered up and made something else out of himself. One of the main points of sharing my story with audiences such as yourself is to not bring about a sense of pity for my story and my life and what has occurred to me. It is to bring about a sense for people to understand that these are things that occur every day and that these are actions that take place in our world all the time, and that even though you may be someone similar to my mother who was not drinking or doing any other drugs on the day of April 18th, 1992, she fell victim to a DWI crash. And that could very easily be anyone sitting in this audience also.
Thank you, Mike. That was another very powerful story. And thank both of you, Mrs. Montague and Mr. Avila. Thank you for being so generous and sharing your personal stories with us. And to the rest of you, if you have any questions at this time, or if you don't have any questions, if you have any comments, you can pass the microphone around and feel free to ask of either of them at this time.
I have a question. Mike, this question's for you. I know Ms. Montague said that the judge ordered the young man to pay restitution for his crime against her daughter. Did the lady that went to jail for her crime against your mother, did she have to pay you any restitution, you or your sister?
Yes, as part of the penalty that she was to pay, Mrs. Lopez was supposed to pay a portion of a reparations settlement towards the victims in the wreck. That meant that she was obviously paying for my mother's portion of the victimization and also for the portion that Frank endured also, since he survived and was in the hospital for several weeks. His billing from the hospital and from the wreck was a lot larger sum than ours.
I have a question for both of you. How do you get over the pain that these people have caused in your lives, or have you gotten over it?
You know, people always say time heals all pain. And I don't know about Mike, but I know for me that time doesn't heal all pain. What I tell people is that I have just learned how to live with the pain on a daily basis. I love Mandy as much as I did the day she died, and it hurts as much as it did the day she died, but you learn how to cope with it and to keep going.
Currently, I'm still in a process of learning to live with this. It's only been 10 years, which sounds like a long time, but it is not a long avenue in your life yet, and I'm still learning to cope with it and to forgive myself for not being there that afternoon, which was a large issue with myself when I was younger. I was supposed to have been there, and I cleared myself out because of drinking the night before.
This question is for both of you. In a school setting, we're always talking to the students about how a simple action can affect everybody. It's a ripple effect, and they never know, how their actions will have an impact on somebody. I'm sure that you have reflected a lot on that, but what can you say to young people about how their small actions can have a big impact on not only you but with your families?
I touch on that a lot when I speak because I predominantly speak to youth audiences. And the direct approach to it is to encourage them to understand by trying to get them to accept my story, not feel sorry for me, but accept it as something that could be a possibility in their own life, and for them to understand that that afternoon it wasn't just something that happened to me, that I just lost somebody. It's 10 years later, and I still wake up 28 years old in the morning crying, or sometimes I'm sitting around washing dishes and all of a sudden I tear up and I don't understand why. And things that I have to cope with every day that affect my relationship with other people, friends, in my intimate relationships with other people, my relationships with my family, and that these are things that are caused by the nature of the occurrence of what we're discussing here today.
For me, when I talk to the kids, which I do talk to a lot of, try to talk to the kids at the schools just as well, and I try to point out to them that, some of the things that Dustin's actions caused, not just for Mandy and her family and the 300 people that attended her funeral, but I also try to point out to what his family had to go through as well, going to court, maybe mortgaging their house to pay for an attorney, that his actions didn't just affect him. So I'm sure it was extremely emotional for them as well as hard financially.
I just had a comment for both of y'all. I just wanted to say that y'all two are truly probably two of the strongest people I've ever met. For y'all to be able to come out here and tell your story in order to prevent others from having the same pain that you have gone through, I think that's wonderful, and I just wanted to say thanks for doing that.
Alexis, thank you for that comment. And these questions are great, and if we have any other questions for Dr. Maury Dennis over here, he's our scientific authority on alcohol-related traffic incidents. So we can continue our questions and comments here. You have one for Maury?
Dr. Dennis, I know that alcohol affects people different ways, and I'd like to know if you'd talk a little bit more about that.
It does definitely affect people different ways. It affects the same person different ways at different times. If a person's been ill, for example, my wife is home with the flu, it would not take much to affect her now. I've been up helping her the last 2 nights and have not gotten much sleep. I would be more affected now. But as far as affecting different persons differently, we have research, it affects everyone. But we are not robots. Each of us have our own metabolic systems. Each of us have our own processing systems for alcohol, so it definitely affects people differently. But of all the research in which I've been involved, it definitely affects everyone, but not exactly the same way.
And what about a 16-year-old versus someone that's 50?
Teenagers are much more affected for several reasons. One, developing organs are more affected by alcohol and other drugs than developed organs. Also, teenagers are learning. If you look at a 50-year-old example you gave versus a 16-year-old, with the exact same blood alcohol concentration, that 16-year-old is much more likely to be in a fatal crash. There's several possible reasons for this. One is they lack experience as drivers. You learn from experience as a driver. They don't have that experience. A second is they typically lack experience as a drinker. They do not have prior drinking experience or very much. A third is when they drive. Most teenagers do a lot of their driving at night. Night is more dangerous. And a fourth possible reason is risk-taking. Youth is a time of taking chances, taking risks. When you put all those four things together, we can see why they are much more at risk than an older person.
Dr. Dennis, you mentioned how alcohols, when somebody is partaking of alcoholic beverages, how it affects them more when they're either sick or they haven't been getting the right amount of sleep. But let's say we take maybe a star athlete who's in top condition and he not necessarily may drink every weekend, but he goes out to one party and he gets drunk. What are the physical aspects that alcohol has on either him or her, even though they're not sick or they have gotten the right amount of sleep?
As I said earlier, it will affect everyone. A star athlete, a good physical condition, still most of our livers only process alcohol at a given rate. And that's not a factor, a function of what kind of shape you're in. The type of things that would be affected would be that person's divided attention when you're driving. As drivers, we pay attention to a lot of things. We have to look at other cars, we have to look at the signals, we may be talking on our cell phone, we look at the inside of the car, the instrumentation, all of that. This is what research has shown the person is first affected, their ability to divide their attention. And so the star athlete concept really would not make a lot of difference.
You know how some people say that they drive better when drinking? Have you all done any research on that?
Yes, we have. And that's not an uncommon thing for people to believe I really do better. We have done research where we bring people in and train them to handle driving maneuvers. Then we have one group who will drink and another group who will not drink. And they go back and redrive the same maneuvers. We videotape both groups and to determine how well they do. And in the drinking group, inevitably, there'll be people who think they are doing better. And we've even shown the video the next day sometimes, and we've had some claim that that was not them doing the driving, because I could not have driven that poorly. The reason for that is that alcohol affects our thinking process and judgment. If the part of your brain that lets you think clearly is impaired, how can you know that the part of your brain that lets you think clearly is impaired? It's kind of a catch-22 situation. And so many people may have the perception, yes, they are doing better, but in reality they're not.
Dr. Dennis, how long should one wait before driving after they have been drinking?
There's some real simplistic answers to that, and you can see many times in literature it'll say, well, 1 drink per hour. That is a dangerous concept. The human body across the board will not remove 1 drink per hour. If you weigh about 200 pounds, that will work. But if you have persons that are smaller, there'll be an accumulation of alcohol because the body can't get rid of it that fast. So it's almost an individual thing. But the smaller the person is, male or female, they need to wait longer. So their body may be only getting rid of 1/2 drink per hour. The best option is obviously driving with no alcohol in your system.
Let's say you had consumed alcohol, but you need to drive. What can you do to get the alcohol out of your system?
I wish there was a real quick answer. There have all been all kind of sober-up methods of running and taking cold showers and so forth. That has not worked. There's really nothing you can really do. By running, you can perspire more. You'll remove a little bit, not very much. You'll breathe harder. You'll breathe out a little bit. Our livers, though, process or break down about 90% of the alcohol. You can't do anything to make your liver work faster. And so there are not any real quick foolproof methods that will suddenly sober you up.
Dr. Dennis, I consider myself about average size. How many beers would it take before my judgment was impaired?
The more research we do, we find the lower levels. 0.02 blood alcohol concentration, maybe for a man your size, would be about 1 beer. Now, you would probably not be obviously visibly impaired at that point. But if we would test things such as your complex reaction time, if we would test your divided attention, we would probably even at that level see some losses. And so the illegal level, 0.08 BAC, is really a fairly liberal level. Our research, we've never tested someone at 0.4, half the illegal level, who was not impaired. There are two definitions of intoxication in the state of Texas. One is .08 blood alcohol concentration. If you read .08, no matter how well you can walk the line, touch your nose, or do any of the other tests, that's illegal. The other, though, says loss of normal mental, physical faculties because of alcohol or other drugs. If one beer did that to you, that would make you illegal. Drunk is a very subjective term. Although it's an old show, it's still in syndication. Andy of Mayberry. The town drunk in Andy of Mayberry is Otis Campbell. Most people have probably seen him. Most people say, I've never looked like Otis Campbell, therefore I'm not, quote, drunk. But you would be impaired, but you would not necessarily recognize the impairment because of what I mentioned earlier. You're thinking you're doing better. That alcohol plays tricks on us to make us think we're doing better. As I mentioned, we videotaped several people, and one man told me, he said, turn off the tape, said, I want to see my own tape, because that was not me. I know I didn't do that. So I said, well, you think we went to Hollywood, had an actor made up to look like you?
Right.
You know, it's really you. He said, I just had no perception I was acting that way, and that's the way it is. We may well think we're doing better all the time, but we're not. Incidentally, a blood or breath test can be required under certain circumstances. If a person has died in a crash or if a person is seriously injured in a crash, we have a law in Texas that allows the police officer, not at the scene, but to have proper medical people extract blood typically from the person if say, a death has occurred or if there's been serious injury.
Dr. Dennis, there seems to be some misunderstanding among young people as to the amount of alcohol content that is in beer versus what might be in a mixed drink or perhaps just a wine cooler. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes. There's a common belief that all drinks are equal. There's the same amount of alcohol in beer, in whiskey, in wine coolers, or a glass of wine. This is typically not true. If we take a 1 ounce shot of 80 proof whiskey, fairly standard, and compare that to a regular 12 ounce beer in Texas, the beer has 35% more alcohol. You mentioned wine coolers. Wine coolers have even more. Wine coolers, typical wine cooler will have almost 50% more alcohol than a 1 ounce shot of 80 proof whiskey. And so this concept that they're all equal, now you can mathematically manipulate them to make them equal, but typically what you get out there is going to be the beer or the wine cooler that will produce the greatest intoxication. Who drinks wine coolers? It's typically young people. Beer, 80% of persons who get DWIs were drinking beer when they got their DWI.
I have a question. Well, instead of drinking alcohol, what if somebody was under the influence of like marijuana or some other type of drug? Is that just as dangerous?
It could well be, and it's just as illegal. We don't have a scientific measure like .08 for other drugs. What that would come under is the other definition, loss of normal mental, physical faculties because of alcohol or other drugs. And it's not illegal drugs only. The legality of the drug is not the issue. It could be something prescribed by your doctor. It could be something over the counter. It's does it affect your ability? We don't have the same amount of research on other drugs because it's more difficult to conduct research studies. But what research we do have shows that they definitely do affect persons driving. And when mixed with alcohol, it produces a synergistic effect, or in other words, a chemical reaction can take place that would produce an effect stronger than maybe more of the alcohol or more of that same drug. So mixing alcohol, even small amounts with other drugs, is very dangerous.
Dr. Dennis, my question applies to the state of Texas. For many years now, the state of Texas has been leading in fatalities, highway fatalities due to drinking and driving. Can you respond to that about why? What are some of the notations about why we have such a large number of deaths on the highway because of this issue?
Yes. First of all, we do have more deaths due to alcohol than any other state. What you have to remember, though, is we're a larger state. We rank 8th in percentage of alcohol-related fatalities, and we've seen some improvement. While the rest of the nation has gone up in the last 5 years, we have reduced ours in the last 5 years. So it's somewhat good news. Well, why is Texas so high? We are still probably more of a rural state than we are an urban state. We have large stretches of highway where there's not much in between. Some people measure distances not by miles, but by six-packs, I think, sometimes. And so that's a factor. Deaths are more likely to occur in rural areas than they are urban. You can't sell this, but traffic congestion, in effect, is a safety measure. If you're have bumper-to-bumper 10-mile-an-hour traffic, you may have a lot of fender benders. But if you have high speed, as we've talked about earlier, speed combined with alcohol is dangerous. So if you're in a rural area, we have many in Texas, that's one of the prime contributors, I believe.
As in my case, in my story, in 1992, it seems to me that the legalities here in the state were a lot more lenient for the person who killed my mother. Now, bringing it to our present time right now, what does a DWI offender have to look forward to within the legal system?
You're correct. The laws have changed over the years. We've seen much legislation take place supported by MAD and other groups to make it more stringent on DWI offenders. DWI offender can look at a range of things from fines, jail time, loss of license. Those are the three basic penalties. If the person takes probation, sometimes people say, well, he only got probation. It's a pretty big only. There's a long list of things they have to do if they take probation. Not drink while they're on probation, report to probation officers, not go in places where alcohol is served, on and on and on. And so we have those types of things. We've seen some changes in laws to have open container laws in Texas, okay, that those have been strengthened. ALR, administrative license revocation. The person can lose their license for failing the test, whether or not they're prosecuted for the DWI. For refusing the test, implied consent law is in effect. If you refuse the test, there's a penalty just for refusing. So there's a whole range of things that the offender could not look forward to but could have happen. If you have a situation where a death has occurred, oftentimes there may be a civil suit that's involved as well. And so a person could be financially ruined because of the civil suit as well as the criminal penalties. Penalties are enhanced the more DWIs you get. The penalties for second offense are more stringent than for first offense. There's additional jail time, there's additional loss of license, there's additional fines. The same is true for third and beyond offenses. Another law we have deals with having a child under 15 in the car with you if you receive a DWI. This in Texas is a state jail felony, which would mean that if you serve jail time, it would be in the penitentiary rather than typically a county jail. The fines for that are about 5 times what it would be for just a first offense DWI without a child in there. And so this has been done to try to encourage people not only not drink and drive, but definitely don't do it with a child in the car.
Dr. Dennis, you mentioned how the liver processes the alcohol. Is it damaged in any way whenever you're drinking?
Unfortunately, it is, and this would be a long-term effect. One drinking bout would not typically do it. But over time, the liver is damaged. The liver is really the purification system of the body. Alcohol is a foreign substance. When the alcohol goes in, the liver tries to get rid of it. In the process of the liver getting rid of it, it does some damage. You may have heard of the term cirrhosis of the liver. This is really a hardening of the liver. So the liver's function just overall to serve as a purification system will be damaged. So that's one long-term effect. Another long-term effect is on thinking. A person's brain power is diminished over time because of the destruction of brain cells because of alcohol. Person's ability to concentrate is impaired. This has been found, for example, even in recovering alcoholics. Sometimes their ability does not totally come back. Much of it is restored, but not all of it comes back. So, those are physiological effects. In addition, there's some psychological effects. Alcohol can cause psychological depression. When you're putting a drug in your system, which is a depressant, not only does it depress your body physiologically, but it may do it psychologically. So those are some examples of long-term. In terms of short-term effects, it does affect our ability to concentrate. And again, the driving task is one that we have to concentrate on quite a bit. It affects our ability to process information. Our brains are very great computers. We take in information primarily through our vision, but our brains have to process that and give meaning to it, so it affects that. It affects our vision greatly. Vision is the prime sense we use as drivers. You could be deaf and drive very well. You can't be blind and drive very well. It affects our ability to judge distance. It affects night vision, which is particularly important in alcohol because that's when most drinking is done at night. It affects our sight or peripheral vision, our clarity, just all the way down the line it affects our vision. It also, though, tends to make us more aggressive. Some other drugs make us more passive, but alcohol makes people think they can do things they can't do and many times gets them in trouble, both in a driving sense and in other senses. So those examples of types of both short and long-term things that are effective.
Dr. Dennis, you mentioned something earlier about synergism. Can you explain more on that?
Synergism has to do with combining one or more drugs. An example of this would be maybe come from high school chemistry. Most people in here either have taken or will take a course in high school chemistry. In chemistry, sometimes you make some different things. One of these is a substance called H2SO4, which is sulfuric acid. Sulfuric acid in a concentrated form will burn a hole in something. It's composed of three different elements, though: hydrogen, sulfur, and oxygen. Oxygen by itself would not do that, would not burn something. Neither would sulfur, neither would hydrogen. But when I mix them together in that particular configuration, H2SO4, then it will do that. Similar thing can happen with drugs in our body. One drug might have one effect, another drug might have a different effect. But when I combine those two drugs, this chemical reaction takes place which may produce something which is similar to the sulfuric acid production.
What kind of examples can you give as far as decision-making and impaired judgment that alcohol may give you?
As I mentioned earlier, alcohol produces more aggressive behavior. And so it may make a person decide to run a light when it's about to turn red, what they ordinarily wouldn't do. They may make a decision to try to pass another car, which they wouldn't ordinarily try to pass. There's a common belief that many people may become intoxicated, they go down the road at 10 miles an hour. In our research, we have found that older drivers tend to drive a little slower, but younger drivers tend to drive faster after drinking. And it's because they think they can do better. So when you plow those things in together, so those are examples of poor decisions that might be made because of alcohol. And a lot of it's tied to aggression, but also just that your brain isn't thinking clearly enough. If you're faced with any kind of emergency situation where someone slams on the brakes ahead of you or stops suddenly, your decision process is going to be much impaired, so you're not going to be able to do that. Now, if you don't face any of those things, you might luck out and make it home. But you've placed yourself at a much greater risk and placed other people in society at a much greater risk because of these losses that you will have, even if you don't recognize the losses.
So it sounds like one of the smartest things you can do is plan ahead and either designate a driver or plan on taking a cab.
Anything that will keep you from driving. If you have a designated driver who truly has not been drinking, that can be a very effective way to keep you from driving in an impaired condition. Taking some type of public transportation, a cab. If it's a young person, we know it's illegal for them to drink, but call your parent to come get you. But something that will keep you from getting behind the wheel of the car is very important.
Well, before we wrap up tonight, is there anything that you want to add that maybe some of our younger viewers might be interested in hearing?
There is, related to a law that we have here in Texas. We do have a number of young people here. We have a DWI law in Texas, but we also have a DUI law. That law only applies to persons under age 21. They have to be operating a motor vehicle in a public place, be under 21, but all they have to have is any detectable amount of alcohol. And that could be detected just by the officer smelling it on a young person's breath. And so it's a very stringent law, and there's a number of penalties attached to that. And so I think young people need to recognize that. They do not have to be illegally intoxicated to have some pretty stringent penalties.
Wow, that's good to know. Thank you. And thank you for your time. Dr. Maury Dennis, really appreciate all your information. And thank you, Vanessa Montague, and thank you, Mike Avila, and all the students and parents and faculty and everyone that's affiliated with Project Yield here at Taft High in San Antonio. Really appreciate it. And remember, your stories will help other people.
Absolutely. And thank you for joining us. And remember, whatever you do, don't drink and drive.
What a show we've had. We've covered a lot of information, haven't we?
We sure have, and it was time well spent.
Thank you for watching Wheels in Motion. Whatever you do, don't take the responsibility of driving lightly. It's serious business every time we get behind the wheel.
And now remember, bad driving is caused by either bad habits or by reacting the wrong way.
As you move on with your daily routines, consider the good habits and the right ways to react that we've talked about.
Maybe even share a tip or two with a friend. You'll be glad you did.
This concludes the last section of Wheels in Motion. At this time, please access the Wheels in Motion Quiz Center. Thank you for participating in this DefensiveDriving.com program. I'm Liesl Friday.
And I'm Rene Alvarado. And from all of us here at DefensiveDriving.com, goodbye and safe driving.